Welcome to Creativity Cooks. Today we are making ratatouille. To make this recipe, you will need the following ingredients: 1 eggplant, 1 yellow squash, 1 zucchini, 2 Roma tomatoes, 14 ounces of crushed tomatoes, 4 tablespoons of olive oil, 2 tablespoons of minced garlic, 1 small onion, 2 to 3 sweet peppers, 4 tablespoons of basil, 1 tablespoon of parsley, 1 teaspoon of thyme, and half a teaspoon of salt. This recipe involves a lot of cutting, so please have a really good knife and please be careful while cutting these vegetables. Step 1. Let's prep your vegetables. Cut the ends or the stems off of your squash, your eggplant, your zucchini, and your tomatoes and slice them up into small pieces. I'm laying out my vegetables in a separate bowl so I can keep them organized, and when you're cutting, cut them about 16 millimeters, or if you can see my slice here, cut them about that thick. You don't want to have them too thick because it'll take it longer for it to bake, so cut them at a really decent width. With your eggplant, the stem of it is also kind of tricky to cut off, so be really careful with it, and if there's any extra pieces on the ends of it, just use your knife to scrape or cut them off. Also, be really careful cutting up your eggplant. Eggplant's a really tricky vegetable. It's a little hard on the outside and a little soft on the inside, so just use a really good knife when you're cutting it or ask your mom and dad for help. Also, when you're cutting your eggplant, be careful not to cut them too thick. This recipe is going to require baking after you have it all prepped and ready to go, so the thicker your pieces are, it's going to be the longer it will take for it to bake while in the oven. Again, if you're using a knife, please be very, very careful. As you can also see with my eggplant, I get to a part at the end that it just becomes too small to cut. It's easier for me to turn it around, cut off the end and discard it, and start cutting from the opposite side because it's a little bit easier for me to hold it from that edge. Also, these eggplants that you're getting, some of them are really, really big. If you compare it to the size of your yellow squash, it's about twice the size. If you want to cut it in half or if you want to cut it into a quarter, you're also more than welcome to do that. When you're cutting your tomatoes, use a serrated edge knife to cut the tomatoes. It helps to cut them a lot easier than just a regular smooth edge knife. Also, here's another tip when you're cutting tomatoes. If you put your tomatoes in the refrigerator for about an hour before you start cutting them, they get a little bit harder and it makes it a little bit easier to cut. Again, similar to my eggplant, I'm turning it around to start cutting from the opposite end because I have a little bit more width in there to hold on to it while I'm cutting. Okay, great. All of your vegetables for your ratatouille are cut and ready to go. Let's start making the sauce for your ratatouille. You're going to need your sweet peppers, your basil, your onions, and your tomato sauce and olive oil. And you want to start by cutting these vegetables, the sweet peppers and the onions, into some small pieces. I'm starting with my sweet peppers, and what I want to do is definitely cut off the ends of the peppers and lay them aside before I finish cutting up the rest of my sweet peppers. Same with the onions. You want to cut off the ends of the onions, but you also want to remove the layers, especially the outer layer from the onion before you start cutting it up. Here's another tip when cutting an onion. If you find that your eyes are burning, light a candle and it helps to burn off the sulfur dioxide that comes into the air from what is released when you cut the onion. Also, when you slice your onions, lay them in a small stack and slice them up again into some small pieces. If you have some loose outer layers in there, you can go ahead and remove them all. Your basil, again, you will need the basil for both this sauce and also your seasoning. So the basil that you have in your kit, just chop all of it up into small pieces and use about half of it, which is going to be about 2 tablespoons, to make the sauce for your ratatouille. In a medium saucepan, add it to the stove and turn the heat on to about medium. Add your olive oil, add your onions, add the garlic, add the sweet peppers, add the basil, all of it, add it to the pan and mix it up really well. If your stove is on too high and the oil starts to get too hot, as in it starts to bubble too much, you can turn it down just a little bit. You want this to cook, but you don't want any of these ingredients inside this pan to burn. And when you add, again, like your sweet peppers, just continue mixing and blending. You want the garlic mixture and the onion mixture to really get infused with your peppers. The basil, it just adds a really great smell to this. This mixed in with the garlic, I'm sure you can start smelling all these delicious spices that are blending together. Go ahead and just continue mixing it and just enjoy the smells that's coming into your kitchen right now. Once you've added all the vegetables and you're mixing it, it is now time to add your crushed tomato sauce to this mixture. And again, once you add it in, continue mixing. Really infuse all of the spices and vegetables that are in this pan right now. Your kitchen should be smelling extremely great. Once you have the sauce all fully blended, turn the stove down to low or simmer and let it cook for about 10 to 15 minutes. You do not need to cover the pan, you can leave it open. Just make sure that the stove is on the lowest heat possible. While your sauce is simmering on the stove, we will need to now make a seasoning that's going to go on top of the vegetables and the sauce while it's baking. So in a small bowl, we need to add some basil. We need to add some minced garlic. We need to add the parsley. We need to add the thyme. We need to add the salt. And we also need to add the olive oil. Once you have them all mixed into this bowl, use a mixing spoon and mix these ingredients really well. The measurements for these ingredients should be on your recipe, so please follow the correct measurements before you start adding them to this bowl. Before you start working with your sauce again, please preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. You can use a baking pan or a circular pie pan. I'm using a 9-inch circular pan for this recipe. And just make sure that you can use it in the oven. So add your sauce to this pan and use a mixing spoon to level out the sauce. With your vegetables, arrange them in a pattern. My pattern is eggplant, squash, zucchini, tomato. You want to continue by using this pattern and keep on arranging these vegetables in a circular or a linear pattern depending on the pan that you're using. As you can see, my eggplant is really large for this. I'm using it anyways because I think one of the great things about cooking is that food doesn't always get to be perfect. You don't always have the same size tomato, the same size zucchini, the same size eggplant. And I think it's important that we know that when we're working with foods, you want it to look fantastic, but it's not always going to be 100% perfect because vegetables grow and you can't control the shape and size that they're growing. So keep on following this pattern, and I'm working towards the outside of my pan, and then I'm going to kind of follow this pattern in going towards the inside so that my vegetables fill up every part of the sauce. I don't want to see any of the sauce left over when I'm finished adding my vegetables to my pan. Also, if you have any spots of sauce that is still open, and by that I mean if you look at your pan and you still see some of that tomato sauce that's not covered by vegetables, you can fill it in with some extra sliced vegetables. You can try to follow your original pattern if they fit, but if not, it's okay. We just want to make sure that all the sauce is covered. When you're finished, your pan, your baking pan, should look similar to this, all arranged and covered up with your sliced vegetables. So that seasoning that we made, the basil and parsley seasoning, we want to add it to the top of your vegetables right now. Try to use small increments so that you can make sure that you have enough for all of your vegetables. We don't need to cover it 100%. We just want to make sure that we have it covered a good amount all the way around. Once you're finished adding the seasoning, you can also take your spoon and smooth it out so that it blends a little bit more on top of your vegetables. Once you have your vegetables arranged, we are going to bake in the oven at 350 degrees for 40 to 45 minutes. Your kitchen must smell fantastic right now. When you're removing from the oven, please be careful. Once it's finished, let it sit on the counter for about 30 minutes to cool down. And that's ratatouille. This is fantastic. You can enjoy this recipe with a side dish of garlic bread or just regular bread, and it's a fantastic, fantastic dish. Thank you so much for cooking with us, and a huge thanks to Wegmans for sponsoring this meal kit for this week. Thank you. We'll see you guys next week.